Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. Pleasure to have you with us. Should be now streaming live to Facebook for those of you over there, and just a pleasure to have everyone with us tonight. My name is Kyle Stelter. I'm the CEO of the Wild Sheep Society BC. Real honor to be joined here tonight with Chris Procter. We've been working closely with Chris in the wild sheep world for a long time, and doing some great work on the Fraser River. So it's a real honor and privilege to have you here with us tonight, Chris. Thanks for joining us. So for the webinar itself, again, great to see everyone here. This is our first one, so we're not going to admit that it'll be perfect. The plan tonight is we have an hour and 30 minutes allotted for the presentation and Q&A session. So Chris's presentation is 45 minutes to an hour long. And then we'll follow up with the remainder of the time going to a Q&A session with you. There's a Q&A feature on the webinar. Please submit any of the questions that you may have on there. You can add them as we go along through the presentation. I'll try and collate them, and then we'll visit them towards the end of the presentation. For those of you over on Facebook Live, feel free to leave your comments. We'll gather those as well, and then we'll present them all here. First of all, just a quick reminder that Chris himself is a regional biologist. He's not setting policy in Victoria. Chris is out on the ground, and he's doing his best for wild sheep and wildlife. So tonight we've asked Chris here to talk about the science and the projects that we're working on through the Wild Sheep Society BC. So just keep that in mind with your questions, that we're not really going to go into hunting regulations or anything of that nature tonight. We're going to stick to kind of the science and the great work that's being done for these Fraser River bighorns. Just an overview of Chris himself. As we've mentioned earlier, Chris has been very avid in the wild sheep community. He's been a senior wildlife biologist with Forest Lands Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. And he's been in that area for 15 years now, working in the Thompson-Okanagan region, Region 3 for the last 13, I believe it is. Chris does specialize in ungulate management, and a lot of his time is spent on wild sheep, but you'll have seen work that he's doing with other species. Moose obviously is a big one. You've probably seen him on other webinars. So real pleasure to have you on tonight, Chris. Thanks for joining us. And just before we get into the presentation, I got a phone call from Kevin Hurley while I was having lunch or dinner about 30 minutes ago. And many of you may have heard that the Wild Sheep Foundation announced their Wild Sheep Foundation Biologist Wall of Fame recipient, Helen Schwansha. Helen's been very involved in this project as well, and just a mainstay in the wild sheep community. And so Kevin told us that part of the award of the Wall of Fame award was to receive a life membership for the Wild Sheep Foundation. Well, Helen's already a life member. So gracious as she is, no surprise, Helen has gifted that to Chris Procter. So just the level of respect that you get there, I think coming from Helen right there, Chris, says a lot. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Wild Sheep Foundation as our newest life member.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Helen, for that. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Like Kyle mentioned, I'm here to speak about some of the work we are doing on the Fraser River to address Mycoplasma Ovipneumoniae infection in sheep along the Fraser River. A project that we really just started here in the last couple of years, but do have some results to share here tonight. Uh-oh. Why isn't this working? So I'd like to start by recognizing that this isn't something I do by myself. This is a big project. These folks here are the brains and the brawn behind this operation. They are involved in making this happen on the ground with all aspects of what I'll be talking about tonight. There's Helen in the upper left. Congrats on the award, Helen. Well deserved. We do have a Fraser River Bighorn sheep working group composed of more than 30 people, representing the 3 nations, all the communities along the Fraser River, Wild Sheep Society, ourselves, government staff, and others. This group has assisted in all aspects of this project, including some of the longer term planning that I'll be talking about later. And this group is focused on tackling other important aspects of this work, including domestic sheep policies on the Fraser River, and going forward to provide productive habitat for these sheep. Habitat enhancement work will be a part of the ongoing function of that group. Maybe just to get started, I thought I'd provide some context and background on Mycoplasma Ovipneumoniae, or Movi for short, and some of the sheep herds that we are working with here. So what is Movi? It is a bacteria that originates from domestic sheep, causes severe respiratory illness in wild sheep, considered to be one of the largest threats to wild sheep in Western North America. It is a very complex disease, and upon initial infection, often large-scale die-offs occur, sometimes up to 100% of a sheep herd, often 70, 80, 90% of a herd. Following that initial infection event, some sheep mount an immune response to it, they beat it. Other sheep live with the bacteria. They tend to be chronically sick, and they shed the bacteria through their noses and are able to transmit the bacteria to other sheep over time. We term these individuals carriers or shedders, and some of them are chronic carriers, chronic shedders that are constantly shedding that bacteria through their nose. The annual chain of transmission is generally from one of those carrier females and shedding that bacteria to their young lambs on an annual basis. The lambs then pass that bacteria amongst each other, particularly after they form their nursery groups. Once they leave that lambing train, the lambs pass bacteria to each other. The end result is high rates of summer mortality of lambs. And oftentimes they're all dead by the fall, late summer, fall. We've seen several examples where 100% of the lambs are dead by August. This disease is able to persist for many years in a sheep population. It's able to do that because some of these sheep that live with it live for a long time. Some of the lambs that do survive may become chronic carriers over time as well. And it causes long-term low lamb survival. A lack of recovery in that infected sheep population, and often continued declines just given low recruitment rates. That's pretty much what we've seen on the Fraser River since the 90s. We did not have the ability to detect Movi back then, but we do believe that Movi was implicated in those initial declines, and we believe that this sheep population has been suffering from that infection since. Fraser River Bighorn sheep, one of BC's prized bighorn sheep populations. It consists of approximately 17 bands of sheep between Lillooet and areas west of Williams Lake in the north, along both sides of the river. Mostly inhabiting low elevation grassland ecosystems, the benches along the river, the Fraser River. There are a couple migratory herds associated with in the area, and they do migrate to alpine summer. Those of you that hung around the Fraser River in the 90s will know that there used to be way more sheep there than there is now. These sheep have experienced significant declines, nearly 70% since the late 90s. And at that time, our best estimates indicate there was about 2,400 sheep on the river. It declined rapidly in the late 90s to about 1,200 in the early 2000s, and has since declined a bit further, and they're currently about 800 sheep. Obviously, that trend is shown in the graph on the right-hand side here, sheep numbers over time. Harvests, licensed harvests associated with these sheep numbers have obviously declined to similar extents over that time, and that trend is shown in the graph on the lower right. At one time, licensed harvests, 60, 80 sheep a year. Currently, for the last bunch of years, generally around 20 or less. There is a lot of interest in recovering these sheep. They've been it's been a really important population for Indigenous communities along the river, stakeholders, and the general public. It was also an important nursery group for sheep that we translocated to the US to restore sheep populations there. We've translocated about 350 sheep from this population starting in the 50s. These sheep have ended up in several states, North Dakota, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California, Nevada, probably missing a couple there. So it's no big surprise to see US-based conservation groups such as the Wild Sheep Foundation supporting this project and contributing to the recovery of these sheep. We first detected Movi in the Fraser River in 2011, largely because we didn't really have the ability to detect it prior to that, or for not long prior to that. And like I already said, I think if we had all the answers, we think that Moby has been responsible for the poor population performance we've seen here since those declines in the 90s. We'd like to get back to these numbers, and that is our goal with this project. The Chasm is another sheep herd that we are trying to recover, located north and east of Clinton, British Columbia. This herd is removed from the Fraser River slightly, but we consider it to be part of the same metapopulation. It was connected at one time to a migratory band of sheep from the Fraser River on Alpine Summer Range and the Marble Range. The last individual that we knew for sure that used that summer range from the Chasm is dead now. So we don't believe they are connected at this time. Pretty significant concerns with Movi and this herd of sheep, given their connection to other important sheep herds in the region, namely all the sheep along the Thompson River. I'll show you a map next. And this sheep herd declined pretty significantly over the winter 2012-2013 from well over 100 sheep to 28. We detected Movi there in spring 2013, and there's been very few to no lambs surviving since. The adults have declined further by 50%, and at the time of these treatments that I will be speaking about, there were only 15 sheep left in that herd. 12 ewes, 3 rams, no lambs. A couple of the sources of domestic sheep within this sheep range were removed a couple of years ago. So we have prioritized this herd to address these issues as well. For those unfamiliar, here's a map showing the two areas that I'm talking about. Fraser River from north of Lillooet down here to west of Williams Lake. The Chasm sheep herd north and east of Clinton. Here's the Thompson River, which we have documented connections to with the Chasm sheep herd through this area here. So what can we do about it? There's obviously other factors affecting wild sheep, predation, habitat issues, to name a couple. It's important to recognize that no other management action is expected to be effective if this disease persists in the sheep population. Addressing Movi must be the first step. With that in mind, there's only really a couple options. One, you can leave it alone. We've been doing that for years, hasn't worked on the Fraser River. There are examples of sheep populations that have cleared this following an infection event, but that's not happening here on the Fraser River. Antibiotic treatments, not really an option, but I mention it here because I get lots of questions about it. These treatment approaches with using antibiotics are being worked on elsewhere, but at this time, there's been no success treating wild sheep. The one approach that has been successful is the ID and removal of those individuals carrying the bacteria and shedding it to their young lambs. So those carrier females. And this has been tried and worked on in a few places in the US with success. And that is the approach we took here. We implemented a two-phased approach starting in 2018. First, we needed to understand the distribution of Movi along the Fraser River to understand the extent of the problem and where treatments may be required. We did this by randomly sampling sheep across the entire study area. Approximately 10% of every group of sheep we could find. I think 81 sheep in total. With those captures, we are looking for either directly for Movi or evidence that they've been exposed to Movi. And we do that with two different samples. So one is a nasal swab, much like a COVID swab that some of you might be familiar with, and a subsequent PCR test to identify that bacteria in their nasal passages. Those would be the individuals that are likely shedding the bacteria and the individuals that are likely transmitting that bacteria to their young lambs. The second way to look for this disease is through a blood sample. And analysis of blood serum to look for the presence of antibodies that are specific to Movi, which would indicate that that individual's been exposed to Movi at some point in the past. Those are the samples we look for when we are sampling sheep. And the next step, once we did that, I'll show you the results here in a minute, are the test and remove treatments based on what we found in the first phase. Our basic approach differed a little bit than what's been done elsewhere in the US. Generally, the way test and remove programs have functioned down there were to capture sheep multiple times and only remove those individuals that tested positive for Movi every time. We did it a bit differently here. We targeted 100% of the females, and we captured them only one time. If we saw any evidence that they had Movi, they were euthanized and necropsied and removed from the population. Healthy sheep are released. We needed to understand whether these treatments were successful, so we monitored the success of these treatments in two ways. One, lamb counts in the fall, so following that period of high mortality. And we monitored pre-treatment lamb counts, post-treatment lamb counts, and we monitored lamb counts in adjacent untreated control areas at the same time. The number of lambs in a sheep herd in the fall is highly correlated with Movi infection status. The second way we monitored these treatments, as mentioned earlier, given the high probability that a high proportion of lambs will be exposed to Movi if there is a carrier or shedding female in the group, we are capturing 25 to 30% of those surviving lambs in treated areas at 10 months of age and looking for evidence that they've been exposed to Movi through the previous summer. If lambs have not been exposed, we take that as further evidence that the treatments were successful in removing those carrier females. And finally, we are monitoring the overall population response through Fraser-wide population surveys as we go. We've only been at it for a couple of years, so I don't have any data on that yet, but stay tuned for those results in the future. So here are the results from the initial Movi sampling we did between Lillooet in the south and areas north of the Junction sheep range in the north. Not going to explain these in great detail, but each of those stars are a Movi detection, either through PCR, so directly shedding the bacteria in their nose, or the presence of Movi antibodies in their blood serum. Essentially, we found evidence of Movi directly or evidence that they have been exposed in all areas. You know, there are bands of sheep where we did not see Movi, but given the low sampling rate, about 10% of the sheep, relatively low shedding rates of 5 to 20% or somewhere in there. The probability of actually catching a shedding individual is pretty low. So if we see evidence of it, we assume that it is everywhere. And further to that, if you see evidence of Movi on either side of a band of sheep, or maybe you didn't, I think we need to assume that it's likely in that band of sheep as well. Based on these results, we are looking to treat all the sheep on the Fraser River. So we started in two areas, Ward Creek on the Fraser River, the Chasm. Ward Creek because it had a high prevalence of shedding females when we did that sampling. Zero lamb survival in the previous couple of years to treatment. And because it is the largest nursery group of sheep on the west side of the Fraser River. The Chasm, because of things I already mentioned, risk to other sheep, relatively low numbers, easy to address. We're down to 12 females. And because the domestic sheep have been removed from that range. So we used a couple different approaches to capture sampling and testing. At Ward Creek, we captured all sheep by aerial net gunning. We slung those sheep to a central processing site where we had Helen, the vet, and a large crew of people to tend to these sheep at the site. We used a portable PCR to run the nasal swab sample, and it takes an hour to run that test. So we had a whole crew of people tending to these sheep for that hour that we had them down while we were running the test. We captured 47 sheep in that band. 11 were determined to be Movi positive and euthanized and removed. At the Chasm, those sheep live in a heavily timbered range. We captured sheep as we could with net gunning. We also caught a few on the ground. and aerial darting as well. There was only 12 females remaining there. We captured all 12. We sampled them in the field, sent the samples to a lab. Every sheep got a radio collar, and we returned later to those 2 individuals that we determined were Movi positive and removed those individuals at that time later. Here's an example from Ward Creek, a Movi positive female, chronically sick, evidence of chronic pneumonia in her lungs. There's Sherry and her mobile wall tent lab running the PCR, and a photo of a couple people tending to those sheep while we ran the PCR. So what did we find? We had some pretty significant results at Ward Creek. Here's the data from the fall lamb counts. We saw significantly higher lamb-ewe ratios in the black circles here following treatment compared to prior to treatment, where we saw 0 lambs in that group in the fall, and also significantly higher than what we saw in an adjacent untreated area at the same time, so our control zones. We also captured 25% of those surviving lambs following the treatment in the first year, and we found no evidence of Movi by PCR or serology in any of those lambs. These lamb ratios increased from about 0 to 40 to 50 lambs per 100 ewes. Very similar results at the Chasm. Again, we saw a significant increase in lamb ratios following treatment in both years since that treatment. I don't have all the data on this graph, but like I said earlier, the lamb ratios were mostly 0 going back to 2013. And the last 2 years since treatment, the lamb ratios were 40 to 60 lambs per 100 ewes. And again, we sampled 30% of those surviving lambs to look for evidence that that they were exposed to Movi, and we found none again. So given those encouraging results, we treated a 3rd band of sheep last winter at McKay and Black Hills Creek, just north of Lillooet on the west side of the Fraser River. Again, we switched up our approach a bit to avoid keeping sheep down for an hour and to reduce costs associated with ferrying sheep to the site. We went with just a helicopter capture crew and our vet and health biologist running the PCR in the evenings at the camp. Again, we captured all sheep by aerial net gunning. We collared every individual with a cheap VHF collar with rod offs designed so those collars would fall off in a month or 2. And based on the results, we returned later to locate and remove and necropsy those positive sheep. We captured 46 sheep and we removed 2 determined to be Movi positive. So a lower shedding rate than we've observed in the 2 areas previously. And again, the results were positive. Just 1 year since we did that treatment, but the last fall we saw higher lamb ratios than we saw previous to the treatment, and higher than what we saw in an adjacent untreated area in red here on this graph. We are about, next month, we will do the exposure sampling for those lambs. And so we will have those results soon. So what do all these numbers mean? This graph that you see here assumes a lot, but I did want to provide a little perspective here. Quick calculations using female survival rates that we measured on the Fraser River over the last 3 years, average lamb-ewe ratios in these treated areas. And we calculate a lambda or rate of population growth of 1.16, which indicates 16% growth annually. If we assume that all the sheep were treated in 2020 and project that rate of growth forward, that is the graph you see here on the right. And it suggests that in about 8 years' time, we would reach 1990 population levels, which is fairly quick. Like I said, lots has to happen for this to actually play out. You know, one assumption here is that we see the same response to treatments everywhere that we've seen so far. It's been really consistent across those 3 treatment areas so far, but we do expect that that may vary in the future. Another assumption, you know, we're measuring lamb-ewe ratios in November, so those lambs still need to survive the winter. We do expect some variation in winter survival going forward, but winter survival seems really high in at Ward Creek and the Chasm in the first year so far. And obviously this assumes that nothing else limits these sheep, habitat, predation, or whatever. Nonetheless, I'm pretty excited about the results so far. And we will see how it goes. So like I mentioned earlier, we are planning to treat all these sheep on the Fraser River. We've identified treatment units that roughly encompass those 17 bands of sheep that I mentioned. The working group that I talked about has laid out a plan to do this. That will take us through 2027. And that is what you see on the map and in the table. On the map, these sheep have all been treated south of French Bar Creek. These sheep on the west side of the Fraser River are due to be treated this winter. And following that, we would be pretty much finished on the west side of the Fraser, south of Chilcotin River. We estimate that there's 540 sheep that need to be treated, and it's going to be pretty costly. At this point, we estimate it's gonna cost more than $1 million to do that from here forward. So not including what's already been spent. We have a bunch of partners. We've had a ton of support. I think one of the most amazing things with this project, about 95% of the funding comes from non-government sources. So Wild Sheep Society, Wild Sheep Foundation, HCTF, Canadian Wildlife Capture, GOABC. So that's amazing, and we sure do appreciate the support. Francis, Tom, Perry, these are the folks from the US that have done much of the work informing how we manage this disease, and we leaned on them pretty heavily when we were designing what we're doing here. And many others have contributed in many ways. Most of them are listed here. A bunch of the landowners helped out with logistics and allowing us to work on their property and that kind of thing. So with that, that's about it. And I can take any questions.
Excellent, Chris. Thanks very much. Great overview, and just thank you for your leadership on this project. The Wild Sheep Society BC realizes, how limited resources are, especially in government, and all the work you're doing in the region. So to make this a priority and the work that's been done is fantastic. So thanks to yourself and Francis for your leadership there, and just on our part from the society, there's just a few people that have really supported us heavily, and we want to just acknowledge that. And I think you'd be remiss not to mention our projects chair, Chris Barker, for his leadership from our side of the organization, working closely with Chris on these issues and doing what we can to support Chris in the field. Peter Gucci and Greg Rensmag have been leading our wild sheep count, so thank you, gentlemen, for your work there. You can see Canadian Wildlife Capture in the bottom left corner. I think Ben's on tonight. Ben Barikoff has donated a bunch of time and effort to this project through the work with the Wild Sheep Society BC, and we're really grateful for everything that Ben's done and the Canadian Wildlife Capture's done. And of course, just the like you said, Chris, the collaborative aspect of this is fantastic. There's just been so many different groups come together in and outside of government. Like you said, that 95% outside of government is fantastic. And you can see the First Nations groups that we've worked with there, and we're grateful for that opportunity to collaborate on this project. And the work through the Fraser River Bighorn Sheep Working Group has been fantastic as well. Just on the funding end of things, Abbotsford Fish and Game has been a great supporter of this project. They've come to the table. Kevin Hurley just shot a note off to me, and they're in for $80,000 US over the last 3 years. So that shows the level of commitment from the Wild Sheep Foundation. And of course, Midwest Chapter Wild Sheep Foundation as well has been a partner on this. So a lot of great work there from a number of other people. And of course, our conservation partners through the Wild Sheep Society BC and Precision Optics, Sitka Gear, and Stone Glacier. So we do have some questions that have come up. The first one I have for you, Chris, there was a question at Ward. Why do you think the treatment effect was mirrored in the control data, albeit at a lower magnitude?
Not sure I understand the question. Treatment effect mirrored in the control data. Yeah, well, I think you mean the trend for across those 2 years post-treatment probably is what that question is getting at. Yeah, well, like I said, there are other things affecting these sheep. Environmental conditions. I think this year, for example, hot, dry summer could be playing a role in why we saw generally lower lamb ewe ratios in November than we did the first year. And I think those kinds of things affect sheep similarly across the Fraser River. So we're working in these, with these bands of sheep, but they're really side by side. So any of these factors that affect lamb numbers probably operate on those bands of sheep the same.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so anyone that has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. I see some coming in through the chat as well. And if you're over on Facebook Live, you can throw them up there, and then we'll pick them up over there and try and get them over here to the webinar. Next one we have for you, Chris, is there potential for rams to transmit Movi to lambs through crossover locations like mineral licks, etc.? Just curious why only testing the ewes.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've put a ton of thought into that, especially when we were first starting out. The rams do, so when we did the initial Movi sampling, we did sample rams, and we did find rams both exposed to Movi and shedding Movi. The thing is that they're not there giving that bacteria to those lambs when they're young. And we suspect that's the main reason why they do not seem to be important in that annual chain of transmission.
Okay. Oh, good. Next question for you is, what is the reason for treating them in the winter? Is this due to the rut and gestation time?
No, there's no real, I think the main reason is just the timing works out for everybody best at that time. We could do it a little earlier in the winter. We have been doing these treatments in February, early March. But yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't do it a bit earlier. It's just the
Okay.
timing that works out for our crew. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any consideration for a domestic carrier program to remove the root of the problem?
Yes, that certainly is part of the BC. I mean, it's been worked on in some areas. It's still ongoing in some areas. There are some challenges with it. Not everybody wants to participate in that kind of thing, but that is one potential route for addressing this issue for sure.
Okay. Next question is, are you worried about sheep swimming the river and transmission from an untreated side to one that's been treated?
Yeah, it is one of the things that can undermine what we're doing here. You know, the Fraser River is just too big to treat all at one time, right? Which would be the ideal situation, I think, if you could do it. We have tried to identify those treatment units such that it minimizes movement between bands of sheep that may be treated or not. Sheep, you know, they certainly do cross the Fraser River. So yeah, there's potential for that. It's one of the reasons why we are putting so much effort into monitoring the response, because there's a number of things that can undermine what we're doing here for sure. Yeah.
Okay. What steps are being taken to ensure that domestic sheep do not reinfect the wild sheep of the Fraser River?
Yeah, that's another great question. You know, that's something that's ongoing with our Fraser River working group. I think it's important. You know, we're investing a ton of effort, a ton of money. You know, I would hate to get down the road here after all this effort and have a new strain of Movi introduced to the Fraser River, right? I mean, it would pretty much undo what we've done pretty quick. So it is a huge risk. It's been an ongoing issue in the province for many years, and yeah, all I can say is being worked on.
Okay. What impact is grazing of cattle having on the habitat that the Fraser River sheep depend on?
Yeah, you know, there is definitely grazing impacts in some places, not just from cattle, but horses and stuff too. You know, most of the sheep habitat along the Fraser River looks pretty good, but there definitely are places where it's a bit overgrazed. So that's going to be the subject of some upcoming work. And obviously, you know, once we get a large portion of these sheep treated, working on the habitat side of things is going to be that much more important to provide habitat for these sheep that we expect will grow.
Okay. Another question we have for you here is Movi potentially an issue in the Taseko herd?
Yeah, you know, there is a few. So there's a bunch of sheep herds that are considered to be part of the Fraser River metapopulation that are removed from the Fraser River. I don't think we have a lot of great evidence that those sheep have Movi, but certainly some of the other herds, you know, in the mountains west of the Fraser River, Shulap's Range, for example, I do believe has Movi. And you know, we're gonna address the Fraser River first, and then we will take a look at some of these other herds.
Okay. Next question I have is how big is the project area in length, and are all the herds connected?
Yeah, well, so the project area is from Lillooet to north of the Junction Sheep Range, up the Chilcotin River a bit, up the Fraser River from the Junction. It's about 100 kilometers of river, maybe a little further than that. All those sheep are definitely, you know, a chain of connections all the way up the river. There are a few bighorn sheep south of Lillooet that are not included in the study area right now, but they would be sheep that I think we'll take a look at after we finish what we're doing here.
Okay. Has there been concerns of the California bighorns from the Fraser potentially moving south, mingling with Rocky Mountain bighorns on the Thompson further south and spreading Moby to them?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, those sheep are definitely connected south of Lillooet, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm just waiting for it. We've not seen any evidence of Movi and Spence's Bridge or Lytton Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep yet, but the potential is there for sure.
Okay. Very good presentation highlighting mitigation measures for Movi. Seeing the decline of such areas such as Junction go from highs of 450 to 500 sheep in the 90s to its present state is a tough one to swallow. In light of this work, is there opportunity to combine sheep transplant from the States in a give back to BC what the Junction gave to many areas in the States, combined with predator control, cougar targeted Junction sheep, and dealing with forest encroachment? That's a tiny question for you there, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, there's still 800 sheep along the Fraser River. I don't think we're going to be looking to transplant sheep here. I think, there's enough sheep here that if we can address these issues that are affecting these sheep, that I think we can recover them on our own.
Cool. Now a question here kind of relating to that area. What were pre-1990s sheep populations like on the Fraser? Is there reason to believe these populations were at or near carrying capacity prior to the emergence of Moby?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. So when those populations, well, we think anyways, in the 90s were as high as they ever were. We obviously don't know much about what the actual numbers of sheep were going way back, like into the 1800s and stuff. But there's a lot of evidence that, what we saw in the 90s was definitely a peak. And yeah, I mean, in terms of, carrying capacity, I don't really know how many more sheep we could have had at that time on the Fraser River, but yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there's certainly a pile of sheep habitat out there right now that's not being used.
So yeah, that's a question for you. There's obviously the habitat piece, Chris, but is the habitat in better shape than it was in the 90s? Obviously, we've had some climate change since then. So could we have the same numbers today that we had pre die off?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's things that need to happen. I think we are probably we need to return to a more natural fire return interval in lots of these places if we want to maximize sheep numbers on the Fraser River. Certainly climate change and, these hot, dry summers, if they continue to be more frequent, that's probably not going to be a good thing for sheep in these areas. But there's still pretty good looking sheep habitat on the Fraser River that's not being used. So I don't think we're going to run into those issues anytime soon.
Okay, good. Some questions here about some of the a few different herds. So what about Seton Lake herd, Carpenter, Marshall herd, Yellowcomb? What about those herds?
Yeah, so the Seton Lake Mission Ridge sheep, they may have Movi too. Unfortunately, we've not done the sampling to confirm that, but the lamb numbers there in some summers in recent years are indicative of Movi. Certainly the Shoe Laps range, which covers Marshall and Carpenter, I think they do have Movi. Those sheep have declined by more than 50% in the last bunch of years. So we're going to be taking a look at that here at some point. The Yellowcomb sheep, that's part of the Churn Camel's Foot migratory herd. So those sheep summer in Yellowcomb, Red Mountain, 9 Mile Ridge. They migrate in winter in Upper Churn Creek. Those sheep are on our list to treat this year. So we will treat those sheep while they're in Churn Creek on their winter range this coming winter, next month.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Is there a plan to retest the first treated group randomly after to see if there was any retransmission?
Yes, well, maybe. So the way we're going to deal with that, we're going to keep doing the lamb counts. If we do see low lamb counts, that will trigger some more lamb sampling initially, just to identify whether they've been exposed to Movi, which would indicate that maybe a shedder showed up from somewhere else, right? So as long as the lamb counts remain good in November, we are not planning to sample those sheep any further.
Okay, good. Chris, can you talk about how additional samples have been collected and tested from hunter harvested rams? How can hunters participate or contribute in the upcoming years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. So we have been trying to take nasal swabs of hunter harvested rams the last couple of years, especially from areas where we suspect that we may have Movi or we are interested in understanding their infection status. I think, you know, one of the main ways hunters can help is by helping, you know, don't bleach those skulls, don't dry the skulls out before they go in for compulsory inspection. You know, we'd like to swab those sheep, you know, in as fresh a state as possible. So they can be frozen and then thawed and brought in. But I had a bunch of examples of sheep being cleaned up a bit before they were brought in for CI. And, you know, it's tough to get a nasal swab with those samples in that condition. So.
You kind of answered this one, but can Movi detection be incorporated into compulsory inspection? So I guess, is that something you're looking where when you do a CI, would you guys do a swab for every single one of them, or is that not? I guess you've kind of answered that question, really.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. Yep. Last couple of years. And we're going to continue doing that in the future. Yep.
Okay. Do you think the infected rams will reintroduce Movi to the herds eventually, even if they're kept isolated from domestic sheep?
Can you say that again, Kyle?
So do you think infected rams will reintroduce Movi to the herds eventually, even if they're kept isolated from domestic sheep?
Yeah, I don't know if I quite understand the question, but I think rams are often the ones that bring this bacteria to the wild sheep, right? So they are attracted to domestic sheep. They will actually jump in those pastures and try to breed domestic females. And, you know, that's often how it happens. So, yeah.
Okay. So what is the population history in Mackay and Black Hills? Only 4% removal versus 17 and 23 in Fraser and Chasm. Was Moby an issue there?
Yeah, well, I think if you have one individual shedding Movi, it can be an issue. So yeah, we saw a lower rate of shedding there. I think, you know, like I said earlier, it's a very complex disease. You know, if you can imagine how these individuals substructure into groups plays a big role in what you see in terms of like lamb ratios on the ground, right? Like if you have one shedding female in a large nursery group with a whole bunch of lambs, you may see poor lamb survival in that group, but maybe that group next, right, you know, just down the river did not have a shedding female in that group at that time. So you see good lamb numbers there. Overall, though, if you do have these females shedding that bacteria, I think overall you generally see low lamb numbers. And, you know, some years it can be better than others. And yeah, and how that plays out over time is super complex, but I think it's important to address those carriers regardless of the number of them in these bands of sheep.
Okay. Is there any possibility that sheep from the Chasm herd will start to migrate again and potentially threaten to transmit to Thompson herds?
Well, I think at this point we've cleared Movi from that Chasm herd. So I'm not too concerned about that. those sheep, I mean, prior to these declines, when we had 100 or more sheep there, those sheep were using areas that we do not see sheep using at all now. So I think they've lost a bit of that knowledge on places they used to go. So the sheep that are there now, they're all radial collared and they are not moving anywhere. Like I said, we had one, at one time sheep moved from there to the Marble Range and they connected probably with Marble Range migratory sheep on the Fraser River. That doesn't seem to happen anymore either. So I think what we're going to see, I mean, who knows what happens down the road? Maybe some of those sheep do venture out and learn some of these areas again, but that could take some time.
Okay. With the large wildfires in recent years in the Fraser River project area, for example, Ashcroft, Cache Creek, have those fires resulted in redistribution of bighorn sheep and lessened or heightened potential risk of contact with domestic sheep?
Yeah, well, so there's definitely risk with that. We wondered about that with the Elephant Hill fire around the chasm, but those sheep have not really ventured too far out. It doesn't seem to have influenced their movements too much there. McKay Creek, the fire we had this last summer, we did have a bunch of radial collared sheep in that fire area, and it was difficult looking at their data through the summer. It was difficult to even tell that a fire was burning there. They never left the fire perimeter. They generally hung around in the same spots they always did. And they are still doing that now. So, I think that fire in particular is going to be really good for sheep. So it did, we've had a bunch of burn polygons identified through that area that we've tried to burn for the last bunch of years. Didn't have much luck. Well, that fire took care of a lot of that for us here this summer. So I think it's going to be beneficial for these sheep.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Is Movi a big thing in northern British Columbia around the stone sheep populations?
Well, it's certainly a concern. Those sheep are probably even more naive than bighorn sheep here, right? So we have detected Movi in a couple of stone sheep from hunter harvested sea-eyed rams. And that has triggered some additional sampling here lately, but I'm not aware of those results. So yeah, definitely a concern, especially where the stone sheep get close to places that domestic sheep might live, right, or agriculture lands and that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks. Has the province ever proposed legislation which simply bans domestic sheep from wild sheep habitat in BC? If not, is this something that the Wild Sheep Society and other NGOs should be lobbying for?
Yeah, so BC's had a sheep separation program for probably, well, as long as I've been around, probably 15 years or something like that. So it's definitely an issue being worked on, and it's being continually worked on going forward here. So.
Okay. Has there been any recognizable change to range use in the area that would impact bighorns, either good or bad?
Range use by domestic livestock?
It looks like, yeah, beef range. Yeah, beef range is domestic livestock, correct?
Yeah, I can't say that I've seen it on the Fraser River. I certainly have elsewhere, though. Kamloops Lake, for example. Yeah.
Okay. How many samples to be tested at the Abbotsford lab being impacted due to the recent flooding and subsequent closure of the Abbotsford lab? Are you sending samples to alternate domestic labs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, well, we got some challenges here right now for sure. So the Animal Health Center has been affected by that November flooding, and currently we are looking at other options.
Okay.
We were hoping that lab would be up and running by now, but it's not. So yeah, there are other places to do it.
Chris, what is the biggest constraint you have to doing your job in managing sheep populations and habitat? And how can residents of British Columbia assist in making your job easier?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that we just don't have access to all the levers that you might need to pull to address some of these issues, right? One of the things that I like about what we're doing here is I don't really need any other authority to go and action this disease, right? And it looks like we're having results. But, when it comes time to doing things on the landscape, burns or whatever, there's other authorities out there that we need to have to do that. And sometimes those things are a challenge for us, for sure. Funding, it's always an ongoing challenge. Staffing, I mean, there's only a couple of us in Region 3, right? So, yeah, those are a couple of the issues.
Okay. If a person is out and sees what they suspect to be a sick sheep, what's the best way to report it? Via RAP, local bios office? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think RAP is good. Generally, that would get through to me. I mean, I'm happy to take those reports directly too. You can get me by email. My office number's on the government directory online. Yeah.
Okay. While in the field, how can one tell if sheep have Movi, and if possible to help get the info to the right person? So I guess we've already answered that, but I guess what are the telltale signs if they see something and think it has Movi? What would they be looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question too. It can be really difficult to identify it in adult sheep. Sometimes they are coughing. Sometimes an adult sheep may look a bit snotty, but those things are it's generally hard to identify in an adult sheep. Lambs, on the other hand, it's pretty easy to identify. So lambs, if they are, and often you'll see this in July, early August, late June kind of time frame. They're lagging behind the herd. They are lethargic. They tend to be coughing a lot, especially after, running up a hill or exerting themselves in some way. Often you'll see diarrhea or evidence of diarrhea. Yeah, so I mean, if anybody were to see signs like that in young lambs through the summer, anywhere, I'd be interested to hear about it.
Awesome. Okay, great presentation. I applaud the efforts of individuals and NGOs contributing to fund this important issue. Is there obvious reasons why more government funding isn't being allocated towards this impending biohazard impacting a public resource?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what the answer to that is. Yeah, I just, like I said, we're wildlife is underfunded, right? So that's one of the issues.
Yeah, it's always a tough thing, right? Where we need more money, obviously, and so on that vein, I guess, Chris, talking about the new wildlife management system in British Columbia through Together for Wildlife, is there more funding available coming? Is that going to help what you're doing, or is that there's no short-term solution?
Well, generally, so Together for Wildlife has been contributing to this project the last couple of years. That is pretty much the extent of government funding that's been contributed to this. So yeah, it's increased it a little. It's increased for sure, but still early stages. See how that plays out fully.
Okay, there's a question here around regulation change. I'm not sure if you can address this, but is there Movi suspected in 3-17 with that regulation change, or is there another reason for that change? If you're able to comment on that.
Yeah, well, 317, certainly those sheep have been heavily impacted by Movi. They've declined significantly along with the rest of the sheep on the Fraser River since the 90s. They've declined pretty significantly here in recent years too. Low lamb numbers, low recruitment. It's the average age of the harvest in rams there has dropped by 50%. So yeah, definitely related. And we're trying to be pretty careful here about how we manage hunting in these, along the Fraser River, but we've been dealing with low recruitment in a lot of these places for 20 years. If we don't fix that soon, there's going to be bigger changes coming.
Yeah, for sure. Question here. It's been a long time coming, but recently it seems that the Minister of Agriculture has formally acknowledged some of the risks associated with contact between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. Can you speak to recent actions or announcements from the Ag Minister?
I know nothing about that. Okay. I've heard the same sort of things, but I don't know the detail.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, price given of over $1 million for treatment projects on the entire Fraser. Will this project continue with more limited funds as they are available? Is there a plan moving forward?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't have that level of funding committed to finish this at this point. I think the way things have been going the last 2 years, it seems that, if we can maintain what we have been directing at this, that we're probably in pretty good shape. But yeah, certainly we don't have any funding committed for this beyond this coming year. So year to year is how we're getting this done.
But that said, you've gone 4 years, treatment's been effective, and the money's been there every year. So yeah, it seems to be working out. And I do know that there's a lot of very committed individuals and organizations and NGOs that want to see this succeed. Wild Sheep Society of BC, we've been doing what we can. And the commitment from the foundation as well, what we've seen, and HCTF has been behind this. So it's actually very encouraging, I think, for the most part. So I know the Wild Sheep Society of BC and our board of directors is very committed to making sure the funding's there and doing what we can to support this population. Question here, and maybe it's kind of been addressed, but I'll throw it out there anyway. But it's around rams, and it says it seems like this plan focused on ewes and lambs. If rams aren't also tested and removed, will they simply reinfect treated herds?
Yeah, it's a risk of what we're doing here, but we, and I think I already talked about this a little bit. But short of treating every single sheep on the Fraser River, we went with the science, right? That from elsewhere. So, that specific link between a female that carries this bacteria and its young lamb seems to be the most important route of transmission. And it's hard to argue with the results, right? So in the States, it's been pretty successful in a bunch of different areas. And I mean, here on the Fraser River, it's looking pretty successful in those 3 areas that we've done it already. So, if we start talking about treating every single sheep on the Fraser River, well, now we're talking about 800 sheep, right? It's turns it into a much bigger project, and it's already a big project. So.
Okay, I don't see any new questions out there. So with that, we're gonna give you the rest of the night off, Chris. We really appreciate you taking the time to offer this presentation. It's really encouraging, and just again, as a regional biologist, you got a lot of opportunity to work on projects, and if we don't have somebody leading this, then we don't have a project. So I know the Wild Sheep Society of BC, our board of directors and our members are incredibly grateful for the work that you and your team is doing, and the incredible support that all these NGOs and everyone else, First Nations, everyone's supported this project through to the end. So thank you very much, Chris. For those that are watching, anyone that wants to watch this, we have recorded this. We will edit it. We'll get it up on our website. And we'll also see if we can grab the PowerPoint off Chris and make that available to you as well. If anyone does have any additional questions or concerns, they can reach out directly to us through exec@wildsheepsociety.com with your questions. Chris is always great to get back to us. We'll do our best to furnish those answers for you. So Chris, any parting words? I just want to thank you again for your time and spending the evening with us, and really appreciate this presentation, all the great work you're doing for wild sheep in the Fraser River.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Thanks for the opportunity. Like I said, I'm really excited about these results. I think if we can get back to sheep numbers that we saw in the 90s, it'd be great to see. So yeah, I think we're going to get there.
Fantastic, Chris. Well, thanks again, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and appreciate you coming by tonight. Have a great evening.
Yep, thanks.